Joining me right now is Stifel Chief Economist Lindsey Piegza. And Lindsey, good to see you this morning. So you've got JP Morgan saying 14% contraction in the second quarter. You've got Steven Mnuchin saying we could see unemployment of 20% if an aid package is not passed quickly. Your reaction, and do you agree with those numbers?
Well, I do think that the U.S. is going to take a sizable hit, particularly in the second quarter. That's where the hardest hit is going to come. We're still seeing somewhat of a delay in terms of the impact of the disruptions of the global supply chain actually filtering into some of the U.S. numbers that we're seeing. But I don't know if we haven't necessarily enough information to say the size of the impact in the second quarter. Down 14% sounds like a pretty dire scenario, and it does sound like they're forecasting more of a recessionary scenario. Our base case right now is that we are able to get a hold of this virus in the relative near term, stemming off that recessionary scenario. So we would only see 1 quarter of negative growth, still very painful, but not necessarily bringing us into a double-digit drop or an extended period, 6 months or beyond.
So I guess I'm assuming you're expecting a pretty good rebound then in the third and fourth quarter.
Well, not necessarily. Remember, we were coming from a very slow pace going into 2020 at just 2%. And that 2%, remember, was coming against the backdrop of massive government spending. We were already talking about trillion-dollar deficits and record low rates. So 2% was not a great starting point. Even if we do see a short-term hit to GDP in the second quarter, as I suggested, it's still likely to be somewhat of a U-shaped rebound, bringing us back into low but positive territory in the second half of 2020 and more likely into the first part of 2021. So still painful, but not necessarily quite as deep as some of these other forecasts would suggest.
And your views of the response from government, the global central bank coordinated action, as well as the White House and the fiscal stimulus that is coming at us?
Well, it's not necessarily important about how I see that, but how the market sees it. And the market sees this as still disappointing, not reaching the expectations in terms of the central bank. We knew rates were already extremely low, so there was very little firepower in terms of what the Federal Reserve could do. From the federal government, there has been seemingly more energy to provide additional support to the U.S. economy, but we haven't seen that come to fruition yet. Yes, we have seen some money allocated in terms of additional research. We've seen some additional sick pay added, testing regardless of your insurance. But I do think that the markets, the American people, the average American with businesses being closed, schools being closed, lost wages, we're expecting a much larger stimulus package, and that has yet to come to fruition. And we continue to see volatility of the market responding negatively to that lack of action, both in terms of fiscal and monetary policy.
Yeah, it's great analysis, Lindsey. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. We so appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.